Welcome to WWJT. What is the meaning of life? Is there any question more important? It's a question about the meaning, not just some subjective personal meaning. When people ask about the meaning of life, they're not asking about, the animal lover who finds meaning in adopting stray dogs or the thrill seeker who finds meaning in cliff jumping. No, it's actually a reason for existence, more fundamental than personality, than culture, than opinion. It's the North Star, the sun by which all other things must orbit. What is the meaning of life? How would we answer that question as Christians? How would someone like Mark Zuckerberg answer that question? Well, he did. He was asked. It took him 15 seconds before he gave his answer. It was thoughtful. And we're going to listen to that, and we're going to work through what the Bible says about the meaning of life. My name is Andrew Noble. I'm joined by Joel Jacob here. And Joel, for you, do you find your work meaningful?
Yeah, I think it's something that's been really changing in the past, let's say, couple years. Where before I felt it was very disconnected. I was working on some product, some technology, bringing that to market. And now I'm able to think about what I'm doing and how it will have impact on God's kingdom. And for me, that's more profoundly meaningful. And that gets me excited every day to get up and be like, yeah, I'm doing something. And this is the reason why. So interested to hear, how does Mark Zuckerberg feel about what he's created, and is that pushing society and, us forward in a positive direction?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have a negative opinion of Zuckerberg. Is that fair? Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, I think especially I think it's become more polarized where, especially in America, you're having these two camps. Society is more polarized, and both camps are kind of pointing at him for some of that cause. And he actually even talks about that in that podcast. So it was interesting to hear. And I think it's true.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's hear what he has to say.
Big, ridiculous question. What do you think is the meaning of life?
It's such a long pause.
There are probably a couple of different ways that I would go with this. But I think it gets back to this last question that we talked about the duality between you have the people around you who you care the most about, and then there's this bigger thing that maybe you're building. And I think that in my own life, I sort of think about this tension, but I started this whole company and my life's work is around human connection. So I think it's intellectually probably the thing that I go to first is just that human connection is the meaning.
Human connection is the meaning. Do you see where he's going with that? Does that resonate with you?
I wouldn't say it resonates with me. I think I can see where he's going. It's a little bit like he's connecting the dots a little bit too favorably for the work that he's done, in my opinion. It's like a bit of a stretch, obviously, with my worldview. But I can partly relate to that to say hey, our relationships with each other contextualize the value. There's obviously another layer beyond that, which is our relationship with God, but with each other is definitely a fundamental part of that. So I can kind of agree partially.
Yeah, I think the word connection is interesting in comparison to a word like love. Now the word love has been misused so many times that I can almost appreciate trying to figure out different words. Mm-hmm. But I think, to love another, I think that's more powerful. Laying down your life for someone else. There's a deeper impact to the word love and importance to the word love than merely connect. To connect does not imply doing good to the other, right? It almost assumes that there is a natural good in the mere connection of things, right? But let's keep listening. That's not the only thing he says.
But here's maybe a different way of coming at this, which is maybe a more like religious in nature. I mean, I always like, there's a rabbi who I've studied with who kind of gave me this. We were talking through Genesis and the Bible and the Torah, and they're basically walking through. It's like, okay, you go through the 7 days of creation, and it's like, why does the Bible start there? Right? It's like it could have started anywhere, right? In terms of like how to live. But basically it starts with talking about how God created people in her image. But the Bible starts by talking about how God created everything. So I actually think that there's like a compelling argument that I think I've always just found meaningful and inspiring, that a lot of the point of what sort of religion has been telling us that we should do is to create.
So to create and build things, the two purposes, or to create and build things and to connect, is kind of like what he's saying, right?
Yeah, the second part, I have to say, that does resonate more with me. And I've been telling you, recently, I think obviously my theology on it is a little bit superficial so far, but it's definitely a start where it's like, oh, me as a creator, a technology creator, now can find some sort of closer connection to what I'm doing and how that relates to the Bible. And for me, that was big. And I think there are a lot of people in technology, that would be listening to this podcast who feel the same way, where it's like, okay, like, yeah, I create, but how does that really relate to, what God has for me to do and what I should do in my life? So I think it's definitely like empowering in a sense, but at the same time, I think it misses the mark on kind of the bigger picture of just like, okay, are you creating to just create, right? Like what are you creating?
Yeah, I mean, it's an off the cuff answer, right? So it's an important question that I think we should all think through and think about what our answer would be on the spot. And I think all of us, if we answered it on the spot, we might lack something. So I don't want to nitpick him too much for what he didn't say. I kind of want to think about, do we try to create? Do we try to work? I do think the Bible offers something unique. I mean, this is a point that Tim Keller has made. Like the Christian and the Torah, if you want to think about it from a Jewish perspective as well, the portrayal of God as doing work and creating and making things, and then involving humanity in that is unique. That's not what the ancient Eastern religions teach. That's not what the ancient Western religions teach. They're like Greek or whatever. So Tim Keller, he says this.
On the other side, let's look at Western ancient accounts. Look at the Greeks and the Romans. There's a number of great myths the Greeks have about origins, and one of the most famous is Pandora's box. That Zeus gives Pandora this jar, actually, this box we call it today, and says, don't you open it. And she opens it, and what comes out? All the bad things, everything that's wrong. Death, disease, decay, and work. See, in the Greek myth, work is in Pandora's box. Work comes out with death and disease and everything else. Now, what is going on here? Genesis 1 is almost deliberately going in the teeth, right in the teeth, of what both Western and Eastern, what everybody else ever thought about work. It's saying work is something God does. Work is something good.
So God creates. God works. And then he involves us in it. So the first 3 days of creation, he separates. And then the next 3 days of creation, he fills. So you have like the separation of the day and night. And then all of a sudden, day 4, you have the sun and the moon. And then the day 2, you have the separation of the waters, and then you have the things that go in the waters, and so on. So you have that setup, and then on day 6, when he creates man, and when he creates woman as well, man and woman, man we use colloquially still has gender neutral, but we won't get into gender. I know Zuckerberg went there too. It's hard not to talk about gender these days, but fundamentally you have God filling his creation. And then he says to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply.
So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them. And God said unto them,
Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it.
Be fruitful and multiply. To continue filling creation, continue creating. So Zuckerberg is right that we were created by a creator to create. It is a fundamental part of our identity and our purpose for existence is to fill what God has created for us. So when you make your technology that you were showing me earlier, you probably can't show it on the screen because it's like, it's top secret prototype type stuff. But that technology and filling it up is a part of what God wants you to do. Even if you don't do it perfectly, because we're after Genesis 3 now. So I don't know. I find that aspect of what he said, Zuckerberg said, to be helpful, to be a helpful understanding of our place and our purpose of life. I don't know if you define it historically, because I think, as you said, there's some things missing. But there's a lot to be said for we should create.
Yeah, no, I think like 2 points. One, I think it's actually fitting that we've come to kind of start with Genesis as a start of our podcast. Maybe it was intentional on your half, but for me, I was like, oh, this is just the way it's working out. And second, I think, Zuck usually gets a bad rep. He's speaking before Congress or he's doing something else. So there's a lot of like negative news around, this guy's messing up again, So to hear him say something that I can resonate with, and I think almost like is encouraging, is nice. It's nice to hear and to think about, like, especially again, like to people working in tech, that there are people at senior levels, maybe not Zuck, but who are Christian and have this almost like role of influence where as they create technology and fill out that mandate to create, they can start to think about like, well, how do I make more thoughtful decisions into the nuances of creation? It's obviously very important with artificial intelligence and some of these things that have like large lasting implications. But I think in all technologies and even in the creative space, like, the creative economy or creator economy is kind of like a newer theme as more people move from working in corporate to starting their own kind of self-media company. I think thinking about how you use your skills that you've learned to create in an impactful way is probably like the question to unpack, and think about like, well, how does this affect Christians? How does this affect those who aren't saved, and work through that?
Well, and you're working alongside people who might not share your perspective of what the meaning of life is, but you are sharing your workplace with people who need meaning. There's no person that's purposeless. Everybody is connected to the meaning of life, and we were created to have purpose, just as every product has purpose, every person has purpose. And I think there's a vacuum right now, or a lack of it. Maybe vacuum is me trying to sound intelligent, but there's a lack of meaning in our world today. It's like, what's the point of things, whether it's nihilism or whatever? So you have like even though I was working, because I worked at a tech company for a few years, I worked in sales. I barely worked on the product team, just here and there. It was a small company when I joined it. So I got to talk to the tech people all the time, but for the most part, I was in sales. And I remember talking to some coworkers, and like one guy, he told me just straight up, like, that, he doesn't have much that he lives for other than working. Like that getting something done, doing something good, that feeling of productivity, he really was living for that. And I think this is the whole idolatry thing, that a good thing can become a God thing. Work was created as this good thing to give us joy, to give us pleasure. Genesis 2:15 says that God put Adam in the garden to tend it and keep it, or to keep it and guard it, or depends what translation.
The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it.
John Calvin, in talking about not just Genesis 1, but also Genesis 2:15, John Calvin says, men were created to employ themselves in some work, and not to lie down in inactivity and idleness. This labor truly was pleasant and full of delight, entirely exempt from all trouble and weariness. And like, that is the kind of work that sometimes, there's talk of like the flow state or whatever. We enter into that sense of work is so good. But then if that's all you're living for, then you're missing the point. Because the chief end of man, to answer it biblically, which is what catechisms do, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That's the meaning of life, is to glorify God. Let's be clear with this. The chief end of man is not to create. Now we create, we work because of that being a way to glorify God. It is still a good thing. But as you said, if we don't have God in the picture, you kind of miss the point of work, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, full disclosure, I sometimes consider myself a bit of a workaholic, and it's interesting, right? To consider, like, how do we thread that needle between like not working and not enjoying that work and that like fruit, and then kind of making a good thing into a God thing and making it into an idol, and working too much and that becoming, the soul of your meaning and existing. So it is definitely healthy to reflect and think about that. And then to think about like what you might change to really get more out of that fruit of work.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is a lack of understanding of Sabbath and application of the Sabbath, because people are like, it's just an Old Testament thing. And for whatever reason, Christians think that that's an excuse for not obeying the Old Testament. But we're not going to get into the whole like Old Testament application today. But the fact that God rested on the seventh day, that God set up this structured order. Now, the Sabbath was made for us, not man for the Sabbath. So it needs to be put in its proper context, but there is a sense of rest. And even more than that, like, I think this sense that I brought up earlier with the John Calvin quote of enjoyment, like the chief end of man, like this is what Zuckerberg doesn't say, right? He says we should create things, which I agree with. We should connect people. I do agree with that in a sense too. Like, community is a very biblical concept. Genesis 2, it is not good for man to be alone, right? Mm-hmm. So there is an importance to community, and I think Zuckerberg is right on the mark with that. I would elevate the word to love and instead of connect, but obviously he can't, as a Facebook or Meta CEO, get people to love each other. It's just weird for that to be your slogan so he's going to connect people, right? And connect people to the internet and all that kind of stuff. But like, we should glorify God by enjoying him. And, John Piper, he turns this around to be like, God is God. I'll say it again. Maybe I'll just get him to say it. God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. When we are truly finding our pleasure And C.S. Lewis talks about this too, of just enjoying what God has created for us, the nature around us, the ability to work with our own hands, the sense of enjoyment that we can get from work, because our work is God-given. Our creative work reflects a creative God. Our work images him. Our work is fundamentally for God. So taking pleasure in working hard is a way of being satisfied in what God has given us. To work hard is to glorify God, and to find a sense of satisfaction in that God-given work, well, that gives God glory.
And why would God create you for joy in him? And why would Christ die for you to have joy in him? And why would we minister for you to have joy in him? God is most glorified in you when you are most satisfied in him. We're after the glory of God.
Even the activity of doing work and enjoying that is a way of glorifying God. So Joel, when I asked you at the beginning, you said, you find meaning in work. A lot of what you said was thinking about why you do what you do because of the impact it can have and the good it can do to others, which is true. And that is true. And it's good. But there's also value in merely creating something, even if it fails. If you are creating it with this sense of enjoyment, with this sense of discovery for what God has allowed you to do, because God is the best tech CEO in the world. He created way better than any other has. So there's good in multiple ways in seeing what God's vision of work is and God's vision of creation.
Yeah, it's interesting. Tangentially, it's did God design in planned obsolescence? Obviously not at the start, but eventually, so that it creates room for the new, right? And the whole cycle. But also another thought I had was, Zuckerberg to kind of say these, I'm going to call them profound statements. It makes me wonder, well, how many other people in leadership at technology have views? Maybe he has a more informed theological view. He said he was talking to a rabbi and working through his theology, but they refrain, from saying it on a platform because maybe it's not wise. Maybe it's actually going to cause more harm. And I think that in combination with what you had mentioned about finding fulfillment in your work has caused a lot of people to question the jobs that are working throughout the pandemic. And you've heard the term, the Great Resignation, and we're approaching one of the lowest unemployment levels in the past, I think, 5 decades, where people are switching to something that's more fulfilling because they're thinking through these things, they're questioning these things, and they have the capability now to say, well, I want to actually switch into something that's more fulfilling. And then employers are having a tough time if they're not providing employees an opportunity to do that stuff. So yeah, there's definitely a little bit of a restructuring, a reordering of companies and their mandates and society as a whole and what we create. And that's uplifting for me. That's oh, this is an exciting new future in the midst of all, the tough things that are going on today. At least I find I always look for well, and that's part of why I create. It's well, what's a positive aspect of this? Where can we go and create a better world? Why do I wake up every morning? And a lot of tech companies say this. It's to make the world a better place. And it's almost every tech company starts with that as their top mandate, and then works down to be well, how does this button, make the world a better place? But it's good. It's good to have that framing at least.
Yeah, even locally, Shopify, I'm based in Kitchener-Waterloo, so Shopify is one of the largest nearby here, and they're very big on we're making the world a better place through empowering merchants to sell, empowering business owners to enable their American dream or Canadian dream or whatever it is, and it is, you need that. A lot of people are are motivated by that. Now, some people are motivated by making money. Don't get me wrong. They're not motivated by doing good to others. Like, that's just a personality trait that exists, is someone's disposition towards doing good to others, whether it's mannerliness or compassion or one of those big 5 traits. But yeah, you gotta think about how you as a company, you're doing good to the world, and then working within God's constraints and God's laws in order to make sure you're actually doing good in the world. So what does that actually look like for Zuckerberg? He might have misjudged a number of impacts that his technology had. And I think he's been open about the difficulties of having free speech or not free speech on his platform and all that. Like, he's got a lot of difficult questions, but you can be a Christian and work at Facebook. You can be a Christian and work at Instagram and still be pursuing good, as you said, in the midst of that. And the one thing too that you're getting at as well is just, there's an opportunity for Christians in the workplace to talk about meaning and to talk about the Bible.
Yeah.
Like, who knew that Zuckerberg was open about reading the Bible, right? Did you know that? I didn't know that. Like, I saw this interview and I was like, wow, I was just interested in the interview. And all of a sudden at the end, it's like, questions about God? What?
Yeah.
And then, like, even Elon Musk the other day, or I don't know how long ago it was, but another interview where he talked about at a recent launch of one of his rockets going out to space, he's like, I'm not a religious person, but that day I got on my knees and I prayed.
Extremely stressful, I'd say, to say the least. But I was confident that at the time that we launched, that no one could think of anything at all to do that would improve the probability of success. And we racked our brains to think of any possible way to improve the probability of success. We could not think of anything more, and nor could NASA. And so then that's just the best that we could do. So then we went ahead and launched. Now, I'm not a religious person, but I nonetheless got on my knees and prayed for that mission.
And this is Elon Musk. Like, we have some of the most powerful people openly sharing that they are considering God. They are considering meaning from even a biblical perspective in Zuckerberg's case. Like, this idea that Silicon Valley and the tech space is anti-God, and then there is the church space and the countryside, which is pro-God. I just want to destroy that premise.
Yeah.
And encourage Christians working in tech like yourself, or maybe the 2 people who listen to this podcast, to be okay with talking about your faith in your workplace.
Yeah. No, I think if there's any takeaway, that I had is, to be encouraged to take a step of faith in that realm, talk more, be more intentional about faith, talk more about meaning, and to think, reflect on myself. It's like, is what I'm doing hitting the mark? And if not, what would I change?
Mm-hmm. So we'll leave it at that. We'll leave it with that encouragement for those people who are working in the tech space to talk about meaning, talk about work, talk about the purpose beyond the work. And I think people are more interested in talking about morality these days. I think there's just, like, whether it's Black Lives Matter or whatever other issue it is, there are moral stakes at play in what we do, and it's okay to be a Christian navigating that. It's good.
Yeah. And I want to say one more thing, and I know you weren't expecting this, but I want to thank you, for reaching out, let's say, from the pastoral or side that's more focused in ministry, to be like, let me engage with people in technology. And I think, like, you had almost this visual picture depicted about Silicon Valley being anti-God and country being, pro-God, and saying, like, okay, maybe there's a bit of truth to that perspective, but we really need to see beyond that and bridge that gap between kind of these, like, 2 polarizing camps that are maybe creating, and realizing, hey, like, we need to connect more. So thank you.
I'm only a drop in the ocean compared to all the other good work that's being done. Like Tony Reinke, he's the host of the Ask Pastor John, like John Piper's podcast. So he wrote a book. Maybe we'll read through it together at some point, but he talks about how in Silicon Valley, like in that geographical area, San Francisco, LA area, you have the least amount of evangelical Christians nationwide. Like Christians are leaving that area, and it is a problem. Like it is a problem that Christians are perhaps afraid of the space. They say things like, I'm going to do a Christian company. Why don't I create a Christian version of Facebook? It's like, well, you could. There's nothing wrong with that. But maybe we need Christians at Facebook too, to make the world a better place.
Yeah. Stay tuned for another pod where we unpack all these other tangential questions that pop up. I'm excited.
Right. Well, this has been What Would Jesus Tech, a podcast where we try to figure out technology from a Christian perspective, opening up the Bible, hearing what it says, and applying it to our lives. My name's Andrew.
My name's Joel.
And we'll talk to you later.
See ya.
Just wanted to quickly say before we end off that all the audio that we use, we will always link to it in the show notes. So that includes the Mark Zuckerberg interview in full, Tim Keller's sermon that we use, the Genesis audio Bibles, as well as I also linked a helpful resource from Table Talk magazine on giving God glory. We'll be back with another episode every 2 weeks. This has been WWJT, encouraging you to use tech, find rest, and give God glory.